Are your odds of survival higher if you are trying to align yourself with the dynamics of the world that you're in, or if you're trying to push against them? I would say your odds are almost certainly better if you're going with the dynamics that are set around you.
Welcome to The Art of Quality, a podcast seeking wisdom in business, investing, systems, and the art of paying attention. We're seeking to understand how the world really works and how we can align our actions to it. Years ago, I encountered the idea that there is a fabric pattern to reality and that we can know some of it, and that was deeply motivating. It means we have the opportunity to see the patterns that create the good, the true, and the beautiful. As I dug deeper, I found clear patterns of quality in the natural world, for example, in organisms, in species, and in galaxies, and began to find these same patterns in the social world, in cities, in companies, and in people. These patterns are power laws, and where they are found, they are a bat signal for impact. In a world focused on averages, things like average performance, average experience, average outcomes, I saw this was wrong. Power laws were what really ruled the world. These insights changed the way that I invest capital and instigated a multi-year study of power laws, what they are, where they're found, and what we can do about them, which will be published as a book in 2026. In this episode, the 4 Art of Quality hosts discuss power laws, what they are, why they matter, where they are, and what we can do about them, and how we can understand quality through the lens of power laws. Please enjoy our conversation, and as a friendly reminder, this is not investment advice.
John, what if we find out after all this investigation that power laws don't matter?
How much time you got?
All right, could put it more succinctly. What if power laws don't matter? I think there's a very slim chances that will be the conclusion today. So yeah. Take us into to the reasons you've been spending an inordinate amount of time on this subject.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first question, I did, we're all always trying to figure out how well calibrated we are on reality. And so I did just read a philosophy paper wherein the philosopher claimed effectively that everything we think we know through the lens of statistics may not actually be true because the frame we apply to the world is far too narrow. And effectively, there are many potentially alternate ways of looking at the world, many of which we might not have discovered, that where the stats just don't work whatsoever. I mean, this was not just power laws. This was normal distributed. This was everything. I didn't quite buy the argument, but that was the best attempt I've seen so far to say that all of this is hogwash. But if or until we prove it is, my power laws were the thing that wouldn't leave me alone for, really, we're pushing a decade here now. So you guys know I built a business for about a decade before launching an investment partnership. And when we looked inside the business, over time, we came to have hundreds of customers and realized that really a small handful were paying most of the bills. And we ended up having dozens of developers. It was a software firm. And we started to realize really 3 or 4 of those developers had written most of the platform. And by the way, if the wrong 3 or 4 walked at the same time, we'd be in real trouble. We had several hundred employees. And if you looked at sales, the majority of sales were coming from a minority of salespeople. The majority of problems were coming from a minority of employees. The clients who were paying most of our bills were not necessarily always the clients who were taking up most of our time. Usually that was the clients that shouted the loudest. And so it was this just kind of endless encounter starting with intuition. And then you look at the data and you realize it's there where really a small handful on many dimensions that mattered were carrying all the weight. And then so behind all this, I'm managing my own capital and I start looking at my portfolio and, the common lenses of how did we do last quarter or we're up this much on the year or whatever, that's the stuff where all the software nudges you to look that way. But if you double click on, hey, what's actually made money, and I guarantee you this is true of all of our portfolios and everyone else in the world, you end up realizing that a handful there carry all the weight. right? You may have caught something early and it ran big time and you let it run. You may have just had a very large position that did okay, but it was such a large position, it was most of your profit. And so whether you're building a business or investing or just looking at the world, you think about the impact on you that your spouse has versus all the other relationships you have, or that your parents have versus all the other relationships you have. Or you look in history and you think about the impact that Mao had on the history of China, or Lincoln had on the history of the US, or Napoleon had on the formation of modern Europe, and so on. And you get this handful carrying all the weight all over the place. And you look at the species level, in the 20th century, humans created more value than all the 10,000 plus years of human history that went before them combined. And in the 21st century, we are coming close to matching value creation of the 20th century. And we're only 25 years into this thing. So, you just start to see this pattern everywhere where, man, it's a real minority that is carrying all of the weight. And if you see that, and if you believe it's real, I think it's both intuitive and also it's very much empirically testable, then you start to say, okay, what do we do about it? And it has implications for how we pay attention, for how we invest, for how we build businesses, for how we build relationships, and so on.
And John, for those of us who have less exposure to the concept of power laws, what's the simplest way to think about the idea of a power law, what it is, where you've seen it play out, just for anyone who may not be familiar with the concept?
Yeah, so a power law is actually mathematically definable effectively in a system if you're measuring something like a rate of change. So take a product in a business, and this is something we've all lived, right? Let's look at the adoption of social networks over the last 15 years. So if you had actually been trying to figure out how adopted is this stuff going to become, one way to look at that is to say, well, how adopted has it been so far? So now you're looking at effectively a growth in a customer base or growth in usage. And what you see is, if you wanted to try to predict how many customers would have adopted this thing next year, you can actually look at, well, how many adopted it last year and the year before and the year before. And you end up with these very nonlinear curves. Some are monstrous, upslopes. Some are much more muted. But what you see is this nonlinear growth. It looks like a limit function. So you have a line that's going up, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. And that is the output. I mean, what's fundamentally going on that we actually understand very well is we're looking at complex adaptive systems. So a complex adaptive system is a network of simpler systems. So humans are a complex adaptive system. We have a liver and a stomach and a brain and so forth. And those things are all networked together in a number of different ways. And in aggregate, we're a human. But then this stuff scales like a fractal. So societies are complex adaptive systems. Businesses are complex adaptive systems, and so on. And so when you're in the domain of complex adaptive systems at the level of math, and then you can test this with statistics, what's really going on is it's network math. So when you're in the realm of networks, people and their relationships, customers and the products they buy, businesses and the products they sell, when you're in that domain of networks interacting with each other, you produce, or the outcome of that is always some sort of power law. Now, it might not be that big. For example, you can have a product that is a power law, and it might go from a few hundred to a few thousand units of sales, and that's it. So it's not to say these things are always these crazy growth curves, but it gives you a sense of the shape and rate of change and likely behavior of the system. And so on a practical level, what you can do is you can say, from first principles or from intuition, you can say, I think this product, this business, this ideas are incredible power laws. My intuition tells me this is a power law. So then you can actually go test it. You go get some data, you go do the math, you say either it is or it isn't. And if it is, then you can start to have a sense of, okay, well, I know that other things like this behave in this way, and now I have some view of how this thing is likely to behave too. And then, of course, in the, we use this for investing, right? So in the investment sense, well, now you can actually try to price the thing, get an estimated value of said power law, and, buy when it's well undervalued and sell when it's well overvalued, that kind of thing. In businesses, it's the exact same thing. So, in my life, the business I was part of building for a decade, we had a product, a technology product that could do a few hundred things. And what we realized from watching customers use our software is, for the most part, they were doing the same 3 or 4 things. So there were hundreds of things they could do, and 3 or 4, they really loved. And it's not just that they did these things twice as much as the other things. It was much closer to, they didn't use most of what we built, right? And then the handful of things they just use nonstop. And so, of course, you feed that to the sales team. The sales team says, okay, I'm going to sell that. And of course, sales respond and so on. And so what you find is, say, within product features in that case, we had a couple hundred things you could do. 3 or 4 of them were power laws. And then you could go test that. You say, okay, they're behaving like power laws. They're being rapidly adopted, whereas most of the stuff we cooked up wasn't. And then the logical thing to do, whether you're an investor in that or whether you're a builder within that business, is actually double down on the power laws. I mean, it's very precious when you find one. They're very hard to find. But when you do, double down on them, treat them as precious, and equally reroute energy from the stuff that's not working, that's not a power law, that's not getting adopted, to the stuff that is.
It's always been fascinating to me how in the commercial world and the business world, everybody talks about concentration of customers being important and 80-20 principle. And, that there's language for all this, but it rarely captures what you're talking about within a power law sense, which is, no, what we're talking about is the degree to which there is a concentration in upsides versus the degree to which there is a concentration in downsides. And then what's the spread in the middle? So, in many ways, I see it a lot with like experimental behavior in startups where, as you said, like you run 100 experiments, but 3 work really well and stick for 30 years and deliver all of the upside. The other 97 are there, and some of them are massive bets that went wrong. But, there's that might actually be a worthwhile experiment to run again in the next business. And I've always found it the way that you speak to it, I think behaviorally, actually, people can make much better business decisions when they understand the spread of outcomes in this way. And it's just something we don't typically speak to very, very much. I don't see it anyway.
I think so. I mean, a way that people get offsides versus this reality. So just to be clear, we're trying to ask and answer what is the fabric pattern of the reality that we're in, right? We're poking at how does the world really work? And power laws are a thing that we found the first evidence of them in the world of biology. And then some physicists, a lot of this goes back to work done at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. So some physicists connected with some biologists, and the physicists were effectively had more quantitative discipline in their field than the biologists. But the physicists started looking at biological systems and saying, oh my goodness, if we're looking at the evolution of an organism, actually, this is a power law. Right. So we can see, and it's wild where these things show up. So metabolic rate of organisms is a power law. Strange things like the number of heartbeats per lifetime is actually about the same, whether you're looking at a mouse or human or a whale. Whales live much longer, but the hearts beat much slower. And so you get to this stuff where it's probably a bridge too far to say we know exactly why these things keep showing up everywhere. But it is absolutely accurate to say in networks of systems, they show up everywhere. And so, then take this to somewhere practical to your point, like within a business or within a portfolio. Power laws scale all the way up and all the way down, meaning, you might say, what about Pareto? Well, Pareto's embedded within power laws. So if you're looking within a portfolio, you may expect something like 20% of the portfolio gives you 80% of the returns. But then if you truncate this and you just look at your best performers in the portfolio, it will still be the case that 20% of your best performers give you 80% of the returns. Or if you look inside a business, you might expect that 20% of your efforts give you 80% of your outcomes. But then if you just double down on the stuff that's worked really well, it will still be the case that 20% of the things that have worked really well give you 80% of your outcomes. And so, and this is where I think this gets really practical, although it sounds theoretical, because we can start to say if that's just how the world works, if that's the domain we're in, then, how do we tend to deal with the world? Well, it's far more common to have a position in a portfolio that's grown enormously. And for the most part, I would say probably 99% of portfolio managers on the planet would say we have to trim it. There's certain risks embedded in that. And then, of course, you go talk to I gave a talk on power laws a few years ago to some investors, and one came up to me afterwards and said, we got to this business super early. And he gave me the name of the business. And every year for 10 years, the worst mistake we've made in our portfolio is selling down some of it because it just keeps growing. And you see that, or within a business, right? You see businesses where it's so precious to catch a power law. And then, if the business is trying to do 100 things, well, they might find 1 or 2 power laws, but they still treat all 100 things like they're of equal importance. And the world we're in is actually much closer to you should stop 98 so you can double down on 2. And I, against this backdrop, I don't think we see people treating things this way much at all. I think it's much closer to, if one has a success, they try to recycle the gains out of the success into something else. And of course, the underlying assumption there is, well, now we got to go find another power law. And it's already hard enough to find these things. I think there's a lot of wisdom in saying maybe we should try harder to squeeze all the juice out of the very few power laws we find, because we're probably not going to find very many.
Even at a family office level, when you do the research at the back end, you try and determine where the capital came from, where it was originally generated, and then how they treat it after it's been formed. All of the stats say the same thing, which is the OpCo provides 90% of the capital down the road, and then, or that first business builder's initial venture will basically be the big risk they take for 40 years. And then they flip into a family office, and then it becomes a multi-strat, diversified structure.
And they ignore everything
exactly. So and so both things are true, and both things might be right. But I think you're unpacking what those two worlds have in common, and what one can learn from the other it's a unique thing, because I think on all of our conversations, even within AOQ, for us, we come across the same thing where, like, when somebody embeds a deep intuition and they have the ability to double down, that's a superpower. And it tends to mean that they concentrate in one game because they're like disproportionately better at that one game. But what I certainly have seen in my career is those people stay in that game and don't tend to want to go to other games. And so that's different for our investor network, is like their game is the game selection. It's being the investor. It's one level up above. Whereas to the entrepreneur, once you find your pathway and your model that works, doubling down is simple and clear and expected. Whereas as an investor, it may not be.
Well, this is where I think the investors have a lot to learn from builders. Because to your point, you literally talk to anyone who built a business. It could be a multi-billion-dollar business. It could be a brand new business. All the way up and down, you're going to get a lot of this wisdom that could be approximated by things like find what works, and then really pour fuel on the fire, right? And basic things like find some wonderful customers and treat them really well. Stuff where inherently there's concentration of effort behind the things that are working. And there might be a lot of experimentation to find what works, but it's like a search and climb function. You search to find what works, but once you find it, then you really, really, really climb. And if you picked a random investor out of a hat, I think you're much more likely to find attention that is spread very widely at the expense of depth within a portfolio, concentration of funds that is spread across many, many, many things rather than concentrated in a few. And even a portfolio philosophy of if something gets a little too big, we got to trim it. No positions over 5%. And it's incongruous with how the world really works. I'd say to the detriment of the wealth of those who act that way.
And when I look at the multiple sources that you've pulled together, right, there's this observation that the top performing 4% of listed firms account for the entire US stock market net gains, right, between 1926 and 2016, which is tremendous, right? And I wonder, talking about this kind of investor operator or map territory framework, like how do you do that as from the map, from the investor to find a power law emerging early on?
Yeah. I'll answer your question. Do you know what proportion of points made Roger Federer? 4%. So in his career, he played about 1,500 matches, and he won a little over almost 80% of them. But he only won 54% of the points he ever played. And so, this is another one of those things where it's just, I think you could watch a lot of tennis, and if you really were paying attention, you would figure that out. And then you can go look at, study stock market history, and if you're really paying attention, you figure that out. And same with building a business, right? If you're building a business, you really pay attention, you realize you're going to have these power law clients, power law products, power law moments. So to answer your question, then, what I spend a lot of my time on, and I think what makes this a lot of fun is, so you say, okay, well, what are the attributes of power laws? And so we know they are the product of complex adaptive systems. So we need to be in that territory, which is most things that go on around us, right? Most markets, businesses, people, products, and so on. But then, from an investment standpoint, we're not just interested in power laws that have largely played out. We're interested in power laws that have some room to run. So, for example, something like Campbell's soup, way back in the day when canned soup was novel, was an incredible power law, right? It was hugely adopted relatively rapidly. It made a company that's now got a $10 billion market cap or so. But that's different than saying, oh, it's a power law, we should go invest in it. And so if the question is, where do you find these things? Well, you've got to be in the domain of complex adaptive systems. And then I do think there's a lot of intuition involved, because something that will kill power laws is intense competition. And so you can go look at, for example, I was looking at property and casualty insurers a few weeks ago, just poking around it, are any of these guys in power law territory? And effectively what you see is, when you see intense competition, the odds of finding a power law go down, because you'll have a market that, if you have very fragmented market share, you may still get power law dynamics. But if you're in let's just say a growing industry, but that growth is being shared amongst many, many, many players, it can be harder to find a player or a good kind of concentrated bet to make. By contrast, if you look at one-of-one products, so here's a great, interesting thought experiment that plays to this. So think about the company Nintendo. So, playing card company, 150 years old, but really for the last 40, 50 years, they've been known as video games, and they have IP like Mario and Pokemon and so on. Now, one way you could look at Nintendo is, well, they compete with Microsoft and Xbox. They compete with Sony and PlayStation. They compete with computer games and so on. So you could say, well, that's a very competitive, contested industry. The flip side of that is you could say, well, they've got a lot of really unique IP, right? You only get Super Mario games on Nintendo systems. You, for the most part, only get Pokemon games on Nintendo systems. And so you can say, well, actually, no, they're kind of a one of one. They have this unique set of IP that does not show up other places. And so that might be the intuition that, okay, these are complex adaptive systems. They've been evolving for a long time. There's some competitive dynamics there, but there's also some unique dynamics. So then you can actually go pull data, right? So you might go pull sales of their Switch platform, which is their gaming platform, and say, okay, have sales of that thing followed a power law? And then you have to figure out some things like, well, what am I looking at it relative to? Am I looking at it relative to addressable market? Am I looking at it relative to the tenure, how long the platform's been available for sale? These things get rolled out globally. And so you got to figure some things out there, but you can go test this. You can actually test it and do the math and say, are sales of this product following a power law curve? And then if you do that in the case of Nintendo, you'll find that in rough terms they are. And so then you can say, all right, well, we now have a complex adaptive system that is producing a power law. We know what the power law is. How can we price it? If you're going to think about investing, how can we price it? And that has a lot to do with what we can expect future behavior to be. And then this is where, if it looks like sales are, plateauing or sort of in the latter part of the curve where they're increasing at a decreasing rate, then you may say, well, I don't actually think this thing's worth that much on a forward basis. But if you can find one of these things and catch it relatively early and start to build some conviction that for intuitive reasons, as well as for, this is all systems theory, right? So for systems reasons, as well as you look at the business fundamentals and do the investment stuff, you can kind of put that cocktail together and say, okay, I have a little more conviction that this might be a good investment, not just because of the business fundamentals or because I believe it's good business or because I like the management, but also because I understand as an organism, right? Like as a complex adaptive system, it has behaved a way that I think it is or it might. And therefore, I have a little more confidence that it may continue to behave that way in the future.
John, to you, well, what is a good power law that out of all the examples, because you've mapped them across many different industries, but just talk us through like what good looks like and what bad looks like, how you determine which ones to spend more time investigating or potentially invest in?
Yeah. In a word, and by the way, I mean, the Santa Fe Institute has only been around a few decades. Complexity theory has only been around a few decades. There are few investors that are known for applied complexity theory, but not many. So I should preface all this with, we as a species are still learning. We wouldn't have had any of this conversation 50 years ago because nobody had figured this out. So, I'll give you my answers for what I've learned so far. And then, of course, we're continuing to learn things. I have found the most use in pure play assets. And what I mean by that is take gold. Gold is a total power law. And there's lots of ways you can invest it in and so on. And you may or may not want to invest in it now. But if you think about gold versus everything else, for most of human history, gold has been valued as a very unique asset. It's had some competitors, but in broad terms, various other forms of money have more or less not stood up versus gold. Gold survived all the different currency experiments that the Romans did, for example, and so on. And so, that's one where it's a relatively pure play asset. And so if you go and interrogate it and find power law behavior, which you do, then there are fewer reasons to believe that you may be being fooled. Because, of course, these are all things that we can never, just like we don't know if our heart's going to keep beating till tomorrow. We think it will, but we don't know for sure. You can never know for 100% for sure if you're in power law territory. All you can say is all of the history has led me to believe that it is, and all of the intuition is there, and the first principles reasoning is there, and the dynamics of the systems at play are there. And so, of course, this means, what shouldn't you do? Well, you shouldn't put 100% of your eggs in a single basket. This is where portfolio comes into play, but you can have higher confidence that you're in power law territory when you have purer assets. One of these that I've not been involved in, but I think we have a number of friends who are. If you looked at Tesla over the last 15 years, more or less within the US, which has been their major market, they were the EV seller. They had some competition, but nobody really got very big. And so unsurprisingly, adoption of electronic vehicles within the US follows a power law. And really most of that was the sales of Tesla vehicles. And so if you looked at Tesla, I do think you could have, through this method, found Tesla in 2013, 14, 15, which would have been a phenomenal investment. I did not find it then, unfortunately. But it was one of these cases where you had the ability to bet on the adoption of a thing that was compressed largely into one asset. And so that's where I now contrast that with the insurance industry, right? So the insurance industry, lots of players, lots of competition, barriers to entry relatively low, lots of established players. There's a reinsurance industry behind the insurance industry, so you're not going to have, for the most part, cases of everybody leaves and one guy stays, right? And so that's sort of the opposite, where it's harder to find power laws in there, even though they're there, because there's lots and lots of competition, lots of competing products, so it's hard to find a purer play bet, so to speak.
Yeah, because it's interesting, even how you're describing it, you're mapping it, using it as a map to determine where to look deeper. Mm-hmm. And then how do you, when you find one that is a good one, how do you then go to the next action of like, where do I invest in this? How do I find it? Because it's a very dynamic metric in many ways. Yeah. Have you learned kind of some of the blind spots that we all have around some of that?
Yeah, I think there's a, certainly one is, and let's just pick on Tesla for a minute. Tesla's a very different bet at a $1.5 trillion market cap, where it roughly is today, than at a, sub $100 billion market cap where it was 5 or 7 years ago. And so we were always in power law territory with Tesla. We could sense that from the data. Well, from intuition, you could sense it pretty early. From the data, you could prove it, pretty early too. But then, of course, if you start to model it out and you just kind of think about how is wealth created, goes back to the family offices we were talking about earlier, right? You have families like the Walton family that created a phenomenal amount of wealth. But if they wanted to quadruple their wealth in 10 years, you probably couldn't do that through Walmart. Maybe, but it would be much, much, much harder than, taking Walmart from $1 billion to 10. There was a lot more juice in that trade than wherever Walmart is today. And so I do think a common trap, and you've seen this in talk like the Mag 7 now, right? So there's this seemingly incessant bid, at least that's what it feels like right now, whenever Amazon takes a little dip, just a bunch of capital pours in. And I'm not commenting on whether or not that's a good bet, but I do think the reasons people might give often could be approximated as, well, it's done really well in the past, and we should just assume it's going to keep going. That's not actually how power laws tend to play out in nature. You tend to get, power laws that if you think of this as an adoption curve, you get an adoption curve that runs until full saturation. And so once adoption of a product, once everybody who's going to buy a Nintendo has bought one, there are much fewer ways for Nintendo to make money. And so you do want to be thoughtful about where you may be catching the asset, the product, the investment. The flip side, and I guess I'll say this too, I think we as a species don't know nearly enough about what kills power laws. So, you think of the wine industry, right? And wine had been around and grown globally for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And then suddenly a few hundred years ago, this blight happened that was killing, with very rare exception, was killing almost all the vine rootstock, or the vineyard's rootstock all over the world. And then another power law, positive power law, somewhere in Texas, what the rootstock that is now 95% of the rootstock for wine grapes grown globally, Vinus vinifera, was found in Texas. It was found to be blight resistant. It was exported all over the world to save the vineyards all over the world. And so, now, of course, we know that. I hope, I don't know if this is the case, I hope a fair bit of research is going into how to deal with the next blight in a little better way than hoping we find a strange species in Texas that we can export everywhere. We see this with pandemics in our own species, right? And so the obvious point here is something ceases to be a power law if it goes extinct. Survival is the primary precondition required to ride a power law. And so, we've spent all of this conversation so far talking about how things could grow. You do then fundamentally, the growth is what's required is survival. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom to be found on how do we first survive so that we may grow.
Or as Luca quoted from a racing driver, to finish first, you first have to finish, right?
Yes.
That would be fun to if you could share some stories on how to minimize the negative power law potential.
Yeah. And I do think about it that way too, is there's, just like there's positive power laws, there's a lot of negative ones. You see this, you see this everywhere. You see political leaders that are just, they kill millions of people, right? And we see this in the human record. You see, like, the history of Argentina is really interesting, right? I mean, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, less than 2 centuries ago. And through various political decisions and so on, it created a set of systems that had produced enormous wealth were altered into a set of systems that more or less destroyed a lot of wealth. And so you could see positive power laws and negative power laws in policy, in leadership, and so on. To your point on how do we avoid negative power law potential, the first place to look is figure out anything that could take you out of the game. Or as Luca talks a lot about, and he talks very well about this is the heart of ergodicity, which is losses absorb future gains. If I somehow die tomorrow, however I'm trying to apply this power law stuff will not happen. And so there's a very, simple set of wisdom. And I mean, in my own life, I used to ride motorcycles a lot more than I do now. And, so there's some very practical, things that could have a reasonable odds of giving you a game over. You need to spend a lot of effort on, within the investment partnership I run, I think a lot about compounding trust amongst the partners. And that's because if we don't compound enough trust, we might do everything right. And if the partners walk, the partnership's gone. And so there's, I think, same with, businesses. The wrong scandal within a business can, erase years and years and years of wonderful work a business has done. Businesses who violate their customers' trust is another one, right? Buffett's whole speech on the importance of playing in the center of the court, as he would say. So there's things where I think it's an insight of degree. It's not that anyone would disagree that we should not violate people's trust, but we can certainly look around the world and see some people who take that a little bit seriously and some people who take that deadly seriously. And we know violations of trust have violent reactions against them. So the wisdom is take trust very seriously. That reduces the odds of negative power law potential. I actually think being in power law territory is its own form of insurance. Not perfect insurance. No insurance is perfect, but imagine a business that all they're doing is churning out lots and lots of products, and they just churn. Some of those will sell well, some of those won't. But if they're applying roughly equal effort towards all of their products, what they're going to miss is the notion that invariably a handful of their products are going to be iPhone type products, and most of them aren't. And, if you're just churning out product, you're going to miss the opportunity to pour fuel on a fire when you catch a power law. And equally, by contrast, if you're churning out a lot of products and you see this with businesses that like go into crazy forms of diversification, you can start to tarnish your brand. Look at Cracker Barrel, right? Like that was the biggest own goal we've seen in a while, right? They had a steady customer base. As far as I could tell, there wasn't really any feedback asking them to change. And then they just decided they're going to change everything anyway. And more or less had a negative power law. They might bounce back, but it was certainly a negative power law for the people who got fired for changing things. And so I do think there's if you basically just start with the simple logic of what could take us out of the game and go from there, there are always things lurking where I think the wisdom is, oh, that's a thing we need to pay much more attention to versus others.
I'm in the middle of reading this book that's basically all about how woke trees emerge in forests, as I would be. And one of the things that I was just kind of spotting ahead of this conversation, the different power laws at play, right? So I just want to share some of them with you. The first one is like seed creation and like acorns dropping from an oak tree, right? There's an artificial implicit assumption in the trees that actually 90% of these seeds will effectively die and 10% will then survive. And then there's another element above where you get to the forest canopy and you ultimately have like five trees that survive to get to the point of a canopy, and then they effectively absorb 90% of the light that actually can serve that forest. Have you seen lots of these examples around power law kind of emerging from nature, or is this more from analyzing like informational systems? I know telecoms used to be one of the big examples in it. Have you seen a merging of those two worlds, or are you seeing like some form of
this connection? Is all us learning from nature, everything we've talked about. And I mean, the original power laws all come from nature. In some sense, if you think about negative and positive power laws, that's a story of evolution of all organisms. The formula for evolution is pretty simple. It's an organism tries a new thing, and if it's useful, it keeps it. Otherwise, it deletes it. And then it tries another thing that's useful. And then if you double click on that, what you realize are, to your point on trees, there are trillions of experiments running all the time. And it's experiment, if good, keep, else delete. Experiment, if good, keep, else delete. Take forests, right? When trees try to propagate, the fail rate of seeds that they sow is incredibly high, right? So what do? They sow a ton of seeds. And then seeds get really interesting properties. Like some of them can be resistant to all kinds of things. It's really incredible. And so the original power laws we found all come from nature, which of course, nature itself has many forms of complex adaptive systems. I like to think about honeybees. And so or ants. So we used to think, you get these bits of wisdom, like, look how hard ants work. And for the ants that are above ground that we can see, this is absolutely true. What it took us a long time to realize is any group of ants tends to have a ton of ants just hanging out in reserve underground in case all the ones above ground get wiped out by a rainstorm or an angry person who stomps on them all or whatever, an anteater. And same with bees. And so we found within nature, you have organisms that have this, you could frame this as a lot of effort devoted to avoiding negative power laws, right? So if half the army who's above ground gets killed, we've got the other half underground. Same for bees. If half the army that's out finding pollen somehow gets killed, we got a bunch more in reserve inside the hive. So there's a lot of effort devoted to avoiding negative power laws. And then the flip side is there's a lot of effort devoted to pursuing positive power laws. And this is, one hive, ultimately having the seeds that create the next. This is one tree ultimately having seeds that create the next, and so on. I loved in your book, and these are some things I'm learning from your book and from you. We look at the trees above ground and the whole ecosystem around a tree, but actually below ground is an even more complex ecosystem that is redistributing resource through a network that can be quite enormous. So it's not just the case that one tree that kind of hits the most sunlight is actually just serving itself. It's actually propagating a lot more that it needs to survive.
What I love about that is one of the things I've always struggled with power laws is like the power law to the individual versus the power law to the collective. And yes. I think that those examples are exactly the interplay between the two, right? Because the power law dynamic from seeds coming from an individual tree, it interplays because it's integrated into the soil. And then as they quote, let's say the 90% of them that actually don't germinate and actually come to anything, they effectively are decomposed by the nature back into the soil structure. So there's just like this this recursive loop that's quite hard to see. And I find with a lot of power law thinking, certainly that would have come across in the systems world, it was very linear, and I forgot about the fact that it's just one map from one perspective.
Yes.
But actually, ultimately, all of us, I think, through this project, we've probably unpacked, okay, that might be true, but where else is it connected to, and what else could be at play? And I love what you're, when it comes to the way that you're even thinking about this idea and integrating it within collectives is really going a level deeper to be able to say, not only where are they, but actually where is it feeding, and what, where, if you fed more resources into it, how would it move? How would it grow? How would it die? And I think that's what always has been absent for me, coming from listening to physics background folks trying to solve this problem. They go to quantitative, and then they miss the dynamic element. Whereas the ecologists is this world just turn around and say, hey, you're actually just, you're cutting the middle of the tree and looking at the rings, and you're trying to map something out of the rings, but ultimately it's part of the overall system. Right? So
it is. I mean, it's wild. Even the math is this way too. It is all fractal, right? So it's like the if you're looking at the ecosystem within the tree rings, you zoom out, you hit the tree, you zoom out, you hit the local patch of trees, you zoom out, you hit the forest, you zoom out, you hit the world. It is fractal in that sense, and you can look at trees or cities or humans or what it does, and that's why I mentioned earlier. I think there's wisdom if you're trying to avoid negative power law potential or the things that could take you out of the game. There's wisdom in actually aligning yourself to power laws, and the reason I say that is poking at the fabric pattern reality of reality, right? We're poking at how do things really work. And if you just frame it as, are your odds of survival higher if you are trying to align yourself with the dynamics of the world that you're in, or if you're trying to push against them? I would say your odds are almost certainly better if you're going with the dynamics that are set around you. And that doesn't guarantee survival, but I would think it certainly raises the odds. I just got back from Geneva, Switzerland. I was on a trip with Eric Markowitz, our mutual friend, who is writing a book on why do some things outlast, businesses and so on, last dramatically longer than others. How do we get 1,000-year-old businesses? There aren't that many. And so we were going around some of the great watchmaking houses and talking to people, seeing the product. We went to some beautiful museums and so on. And there was a line that stuck out. We were touring right in the center of where many of the famous Swiss watchmaking brands that we're all aware of, they're all clustered together. They're manufacturers. And right in the middle is a college, a horological college, which trains the next generation of watchmakers. And so we were fortunate to get a tour. So we, meet some emerging watchmakers and so on. And at some point we said, this is a beautiful college. Where does the funding come from? And the director of the college said, well, Hans Wilsdorf, who's the founder of Rolex, provided a foundation, and that foundation funds, at least partially funds, our college to produce the next generation of watchmakers. And that's the same thing that's going on in the forest, right? The forest is looking out for not just the current generation, but the next. The watchmakers are looking out for not just the current generation, but the next. And that just, to me, that sort of crystallize. You can see this in businesses, right? If you just extract, your odds of dying go up. And equally, if you only look to the future, your odds of getting there go up. But if you can actually nurture the present and the future, and ideally do it in congruity with how the world works, your odds of survival and ultimately good outcomes go up.
Yeah, what I love, me personally anyway, what I love about what you're describing is you're using it as a map for how to navigate behaviorally these over time better. Because it's, as you describe it, like the power law outcome, there's an extension of the outcome that is implicit. Like you have to, in an ecosystem, you have to reinvest back into the youth to be able to continue to grow, right? But ultimately, the way you speak to power laws, it's almost as a dynamic outcome that over a rolling 2 to 5 year period, hopefully is an improving distribution or an improving outcome over time, right? And that's what I think is very unique to how you view that. I love that framing.
There was a line, we're always trying to improve our intuition and also explain this stuff better. And there was a line from the watchmaking school that really stuck with me. And so go back to the evolutionary algorithm, try things, keep what works, delete the rest. That explains evolution of organisms, that explains evolution of businesses, that explains evolution of societies, of cities, of just about everything. How you manage your relationships, how you communicate with each other. So it's, try things, delete what works, keep what works, delete the rest. And this great line is we were kind of asking questions along the lines of, so what are you here to do? So you've now got this sort of flywheel going of creating the next generation who produce a product that sells, that funds creating the next generation of watchmakers. And the director of the school said, we respect tradition and we support innovation. And I think we will spend the rest of our lives figuring out all the wisdom within those 4 words. But that is the tension. You have to respect tradition. And of course, in the right ways. If all you do is respect tradition, you never evolve. If you never evolve, eventually something takes you out. But equally, to raise your odds of survival, you also need to continue to innovate. And I think that to me kind of sums all of this up: respect tradition and support innovation.
Reminds me of the quote of D. Hock: compete individually, but cooperate on a system level. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's it right there.
Even in culturally really interesting, because the work that Eric is doing over in Japan, like that is effectively, they respect tradition, and almost to the point that they stopped innovating at scale in many ways and just focused on building up cash balance sheets and cash balances on their balance sheet for decades, serving the old structures rather than open to the new.
What's interesting, he told me some stories that I'm not gonna give the name because this is a story that I think will be in his book that will be excellent. But he was telling me the story of a business that did a certain thing for centuries, many centuries. They only did this one thing. Unsurprisingly, they were the best. They built a product that was designed to be serviced every few hundred years. Imagine that, right? Imagine buying a laptop and being told you need to bring this in about 200 years to get service. It's just wild. But anyway, so they respected that tradition for a long time, but then they eventually diversified much more further afield. And ultimately that diversification resulted in the death of the business. And so my point is there, and he'll speak much more fluently and in much more detail to this, but there was this, we over-innovated, we lost our roots, and then we died. The flip side of that, to your point, is he had a lot of other stories, which he'll speak to in his book about, these businesses that get passed down from family to family to, it's family business. Well, that's great until the family is very tiny and you run out of people to carry the mantle. And so this comes back to that balance of respect, tradition, support, innovation. And I think there are a lot of if you were thinking about that thing, if you really wanted to build a 1,000-year business, I think you would find a lot of wisdom in, we've got to root ourselves in tradition, but we can't just stop there. We have to support innovation as well.
It's very satisfying. This, which I say satisfying, maybe from on the basis of my own biases, but this invitation that you're offering, which satisfied me, may frustrate some listening. I don't know, but it's a refusal to pick sides necessarily, that there's some kind of synthesis here that is very interesting. And I'll read, it made me think of this passage from a book I've been spending a lot of time with by of all things, a Christian mystic. And what this fellow, he talks about true missions and arbitrary missions. And I'll quote, he says, a true mission on earth serves the cause of ennoblement of that which is, i.e., what lives as tradition. It brings an impulse effecting the rejuvenation and intensification of tradition. Arbitrary missions, on the contrary, aim at revolutionizing the course of mankind's history and substituting specific innovations for what lives as tradition. And what our fellow here is saying is that trying to turn things upside down for the sake of radical disruption tends not to lead to things that last very long. And he would call that an arbitrary mission.
The
contrast to that being sacred, and the sacred is a synthesis.
Yes, it comes down to what are you in service of? I think we've probably all seen and experienced this is just a particular type of person that this is easy to see in, the founder who's out to be disruptive and they have no idea why. They're running a playbook without understanding what the playbook's running on. And then the reverse,
probably
too,
with
right?
someone else's money.
Probably, yeah. But then there's the reverse too, and that's partly why how people spend their own money is an interesting tell. You can see people who are on genuine missions, and they're putting everything they've got into it. And whether or not they're right almost isn't the point, but what they're in service of can be a very important tell.
Is it an arbitrary or is it a sacred mission?
And some of this too, I mean, we can see this again with nature. Paul, I'm thinking of what we're learning about trees. The trees that are the major movers of resource like water and sap within their ecosystem and nutrients. You get these trees that can just move incredible amounts of resource around the ecosystem. If they were only in service of themselves, they really wouldn't do that, basically. They just wouldn't, right? And so they are absolutely in service of a broader ecosystem, and in so doing, they thrive. To me, this all just easily connects together. So then you get these pieces of wisdom, which we find in cultures today all over the world and for thousands of years and in all different ways. Things like do as you would be done by, right? Like that is another form of, if you make this about yourself, probably not going to work. And this just, I think it all hangs right back together, which goes right back to where we started this, which is what is the fabric pattern of reality? What can we learn of it? I think we can certainly learn some of it. I don't think we can ever learn all of it, but what can we learn of it? And what we learn, what can we do about it?
Yeah. And I think for me, there's a dangerous part to studying power laws to a certain extent. And the dangerous part is you consider everything unequal, and the unequal is a pattern that's actually dangerous, and that every system you ever look at is, frankly, it's almost like a doomsday scenario where you just keep seeing that pattern. And certainly from the Santa Fe side of things, I think the message isn't that. The message is dynamically assess what the pattern is telling you, and then how it's moving and how quickly it's moving. And frankly, is this a system where the outcomes concentrate towards one side or the other? And what's the relative risk reward outcome? And that, I just think, is I've seen, unfortunately, those who have good intentions come to the power law maps through an ESG lens, and they almost like over abstract that as the world, and the world is unequal, and all of us technically are power laws. If you look at our DNA and how it evolved, and we're X% of the world that came from that small patch of land in Africa, like we are all technically within one. And it's this funny one where I've found the word unequal being applied to what you're describing as a power law distribution, and then it being attributed to the system as a pattern other than an output. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's. I think sometimes people need to be careful in going too far with what is an output from a system instead of, a feature.
Yeah, well, and this is also where you get negative and positive power laws. So for example, I haven't seen the data, but I guarantee you something like fentanyl is a power law. If you looked at adoption of fentanyl, I'm sure it's just terrifying. And of course, it's horrible. But to your point on equal and unequal, this is where my mind goes to power law of what? So I would say something like e-commerce, right? Generally, the major e-commerce winners, at least to date globally, have followed power law paths as the world has adopted e-commerce. And so you get a lot of wealth creation there. And then you get to questions like, well, how much wealth was created for the billionaires that for some reason the world likes to pick on right now versus all the other constituents within that system? Millions of small businesses run on Amazon, and they have, now probably 1 billion plus customers. And here within that, so then we can say, okay, well, if that system gets overly extractive, we know what happens in nature when a system gets overly extractive. And equally, if that system doesn't do enough to support itself, we know what happens there too. And so to your point, which I think is where you're going, is equal and unequal is almost a red herring. We know the distribution within complex systems is a power law. But then you can say within that distribution, is that a sustainable thing? I think is kind of what you're poking at. Right? Like having a few trees in the forest that are substantially bigger than the others is irrelevant in and of itself. It's much more relevant whether those trees are taking all of the nutrients out of the forest and leaving nothing for the rest, or whether they're supporting the rest.
And to add to that, isn't sustainable, but also what I would find funny about that applied to this scenario is the tree will kill itself eventually. Like there's a rate of death in the biggest tree, right? So you're mapping the power law, but you might be the day before the turkey gets killed, right? So factoring that in is really important. So yeah. No, I love that. That's that's exactly what I was trying to put words to.
I think a lot of I think there's a large amount of what frustrates people with scale that is actually just a misunderstanding of the dynamics of scale. And so what I mean by that is, we all know people like this, and then we know businesses like this. It is the nature of the world, and it's true today, and it was true 1,000 years ago, that things like wealth tends to cluster. And some people just hate that that's how things work, but it is just how things work. The more important questions are things like, well, does the wealth cluster and then everyone else is kind of left to starve to death? Or does the wealth cluster and effectively bring others up with it? I'd say for the most part, as we've watched forms of economy evolve, if you look at like infant mortality, a few hundred years ago, 1 in 2 kids was dead by the age of 5 globally. And now, even in the poorest parts of the world, there's about a 95% survival rate past the age of 5, no matter where you're born, which is incredible. And are things perfect? No, far, far, far from it. But a metric like, do the humans survive, I think is a much more useful metric than, well, I'm a little angry because wealth seems to be clustering. And the more useful and practical points is wealth flowing in a way where it helps support what's around it, as opposed to just wealth clustered and now, maybe we need to fix that. You can imagine lots of value destruction for everybody that could occur or has occurred. Right? We have this in the economic history, right? When you get systems that say our fundamental goal is to redistribute all forms of wealth, you basically kill incentives for wealth creation. Wealth stops being creative, then in aggregate wealth goes down. And you actually make the system itself much more fragile. And they're incredibly sad stories of, I'm thinking, many of the experiments with communism, where effectively that was the thrust, and millions or tens of millions of people starved to death as a result. And I'm not picking on specific political systems per se. I'm just saying, if you look at it in a systems lens, that made the system less fragile, less likely to survive, far worse off. And that was really just pushing against the natural order of things.
Yeah. I'll park the nature examples after this one, but in the 60s, Ireland Inc. thought they were geniuses, and they basically wanted to encourage forestry management. So they wanted to be able to incentivize people to invest in forest land because it had all been destroyed. So they basically turned around and gave this incentive for one type of tree, and the one type of tree was planted and was like a 15-year yield. And we're now getting to a point that there's this large percentage of land in Ireland that is concentrated to this mono tree, like a mono ecosystem with this one type of tree. And that one tree kills all diversity within the ecosystem down below the tree. And so you had a human intervention that designed an incentive structure. And now the economics at the back end of those forests are awful. And now they're ripping them all apart and now trying to go back to just what was wild and then nudge the system in the way you're talking about. So it's this really interesting one of like, they took what was a natural process that would have been a power law from what was natural, and then human intervention destroyed it. Now there's no distribution, and then they have to rebuild the distribution again.
That's so interesting. It makes me think about, and I think you can tell a lot about a business and a person just by trying to figure out, do they believe they are subservient to reality, or are they trying to dominate reality? which is exactly what you're talking about. So I think the wisdom is found in ultimately trees and nature and forests are going to behave how they're going to behave. And we can cut them down, right? We can dominate them. We can kill a forest. We know how to do that. But we can't just sort of incept a thing we want, right? We have to be subservient to how the thing works. And so you see lots and lots and lots of cases where, like, the suppression of fires in California leading to these catastrophic events, or the Ireland forest example, where when we try to dominate reality at the expense of being subservient to it, it tends to go badly. I'd say the exact same thing of a business. When a business just sort of says, this product is absolutely going to work, I don't care what anything thinks, I have to show people what the world needs to be. There's been a lot of capital destroyed because there wasn't enough hubris to say, well, actually, for reasons maybe we don't understand, no one cares about this.
Yeah, and even in the airline space, you have a duopoly, or you have monopoly, or you have industries over time, they'll concentrate towards these outcomes that we all perceive as really good investment outcomes. But I think, like, ultimately, what I love about what you're describing is you can look at it at a young stage of maturity versus the middle and at a mature point, and see where it goes.
I would argue at an aggregate level, and this is kind of how I look at portfolios, the keys to survival are found in mature power laws. The keys to growth are found in young power laws. And you can think of that as,
how do you distinguish?
Well, the trick is, or the challenge is always, something that looks like a power law. The younger it is, the less certain we can be about its future behavior, right? The older it is, generally, the more certain we can be about its behavior. Nothing is ever guaranteed. But just to draw an extreme case, take an asset like gold. The odds that people stop thinking gold is valuable are incredibly low. There's still a bunch of it underground. There's a bunch of it above ground. There's extremely wide ownership, right? We've got billions of people that own it. Probably the majority of the world, if you include jewelry, it owns gold. And so that's a total power law that is very mature in its adoption. And so the odds that if you have some gold, it's going to go to, no one's going to value it, I think, are very low. So if you're saying, well, how do I survive for 1,000 years or whatever, gold's a pretty useful asset in answering that question. Of course, there's a different question, which is, well, how much can gold appreciate in value? And then, of course, you get to relative to what, and we don't need to go there. But odds are gold can't appreciate the same way that the new hot business that turns into the next Amazon can appreciate. But equally, the odds of the new hot business turning into the next Amazon are much lower, much less well-known, even if it's been following a power law for 4, 5, 6 years. There are lots of reasons why it could stop. A lot of businesses that did really well for a decade and then got blown up by debt or whatever. And so that's why I say I think the keys to survival are the mature power laws, because we think we understand why they are what they are, that they will continue and so on, but they tend to not grow as much or not have as much future growth. And then the keys to growth are the ones that actually could, if they continue to follow that path, that power law path, there's a lot of wealth and ecosystem and so on in their future.
A lot of the folks, obviously, in our network and orbits are thinking about this through an investment lens. And when they're looking at the greats and trying to study the greats, through this, have you changed the way you look at great investors and good investors over time and analyze their kind of portfolio, how they invest over time, and the portfolio construction side of it?
Yeah, significantly. And this is all, one of the funny things about the investment business is you can be right for the wrong reasons and wrong for the right reasons. And so there are people who have had phenomenal investment track records, and they were just lucky. They thought they were skillful, but they were just lucky. And then the reverse of that, probably some of the most talented investors ever just were unlucky long enough that they got taken out of the game. And so we can never know, Malbison's got this great book on what is luck versus skill. And I think often of his framing that an area involves skill if it's a game where you can choose to lose on purpose. And so in investing, there are things we all know how to do where you could go just incinerate capital. So there is skill there, absolutely. But there's also luck. And to answer your question, we all have mutual friends that got to something like an Amazon early. And I always deeply respect people who are willing to be thoughtful about how much they were right about versus how much they were lucky. And we've all had this in our own lives too. So I'm thinking of Amazon. I know people who got to Amazon early, and their reasons for getting into Amazon were reasons that actually didn't turn out to be very true. But of course, Amazon still did very, very well. And then, of course, I think the investors, and of course, we all try to be these, that have the highest odds of success in the future are ones that are constantly trying to figure out, how accurately did I judge that thing, regardless of how this is process over outcome, right? Regardless of how it did on a forward basis, was I right for the right reasons? And was I wrong for the right reasons? And so that's how to answer your question, that's how I look at it. So, something like, I think about Munger's great diatribe on how to create a $2 trillion business, which he's of course using Coke as the example. And, he just goes through the whole thing. It's like, if you wanted a product that would just get adopted by most of the world, make it addictive and make it something that you could get someone to think about, and make it, he goes through more or less every kind of popular discipline. Is like, here's all the things that you'd want. And then of course he's describing Coca-Cola. And that's a case of when you get somebody who, and you certainly see this in the business world, right? You get people who creating products like this, and they know what they're doing, and it doesn't guarantee success, but they know that they are, my words, but people have lots of ways of saying this, they're trying to act congruent with reality. They know if they create a substance that can make you feel good, that can make you look good, that can make you sound good, that can, whatever, they know that the odds are much better than creating a product where it's probably unpopular to even admit that you use it, right? And so that's how I tend to look at folks: is were their investment actions congruent with how the world works, and then were they successful as a result or not?
How do you do that when from the outside looking at the best investors, you only get like IRRs, track record, like cohorts of investment tranches, and then like how do you
positions in portfolio? And I mean, I should be the first to admit that there are lots of ways you can invest that have nothing to do with power laws. So you think like the pod shops, right? I mean, effectively, the pod shops are providing an enormous amount of the liquidity currently in the market. They trade very, very actively. They have very, very tight risk parameters. They massively distribute capital across many managers. If a manager is down too much, too often, they're gone. So they're never going to find a Coke and write it. It's just not how they're set up. They're playing a very different game. Now, there are still power laws within that game. For example, you do see a minority of managers will make the majority of, and then we could double click on skill and luck and all that. But you have to look at that a different way. And that's not a way, I mean, I don't have the data, nor do I have the skills to analyze specifically that. But you can look at investors. I was just talking to Eric about an investor who's a mentor of his who has been investing for 40 or 50 years. And in that time period has made 27 investments, like 27 total. And so that's under one a year. In aggregate, it's done phenomenally well. One of those was getting to Berkshire very early. And so you could actually go interrogate that. I would say in the investment management space, Buffett, in all sorts of ways, is a huge power law. He was one of the early ones to transition from kind of what we might call today value to growth, but that was also how the world was transitioning. He's certainly been able to compound capital at incredible rates. He also is one of the few that can explain what he's doing with uncommon fluency. So you kind of put all that together, but then you could interrogate this manager and say, well, was Buffett your next door neighbor and that's why you got in early and you just would rather play golf than look at your portfolio, and so you held on to Berkshire for 40 years, but you didn't even realize that it was most of the gains in your book? Or were you actually, I mean, this is why we all keep journals and stuff, right? Like our brains are good at fooling ourselves, but we could look at the first principles reasoning behind that investment, and there would be cases where that person's mostly lucky, and there would be cases where that person's mostly skillful. And I do think we could start to pick that apart in those ways. And you could say the same, I guess, of power laws, right? I mean, I know that person's portfolio because we talked a little bit about it. I know that they are in multiple businesses that are writing very powerful power laws. And so whether or not they use that language or another language, there are many ways to describe it. You might just give a general speech on compounders, but clearly this person knew that amongst other things, duration, time overwhelms everything in the long run, right? If you're only going to make 27 investments in 40 years, you probably really understand that. And so it's those things where I think you could then start to pick it apart and say that the thought experiment I run all the time, and what I try to apply to myself is, if I were to live 1,000 lifetimes in how many of those lifetimes am I successful on the things that matter to me? So, of course, in an investment sense, I would like a good track record. And so I try not to do things that could blow up the fund tomorrow. I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't think it's a way to treat others well. And a good kind of screen for that is like, if I were to do this thing 1,000 times, is it successful in more of them than not? And equally, because you're not going to be successful at everything, you go back to things like I mentioned, compounding trust within a partnership. That's crucial because everyone's going to have difficult periods in partnership. Whether you're talking about a marriage or a business or an investment partnership, there's going to be hard times. And if you're not built to withstand those, i.e. something ends in divorce or dissolution of the business or dissolution of the partnership, then forget hunting power laws. Even if you have them, you're not going to get them. You're not going to get the benefit.
Yeah, it's not sustainable. Yeah. Well, we haven't even managed to get onto the quality and relationship side and how power laws map onto that, but I think we'll have to save that for round 2. Yeah, John, I guess in terms of the journey within power law, can you map out kind of your next, call it, year or so in terms of some of the experiments that you're running?
That's a good one.
I am putting the book.
Well, I am trying to put as much of this as I can in a book that will be out next year. And to open the kimono a little bit on that one, effectively the book is kind of an argument in 3 parts. It's not even really an argument in the classical sense. So it first explains a lot of what we've talked about, which is I do think predominantly what's going on in the world, which is how nature works, is power laws, not some of the other things that we sometimes attribute to. So part 1 is power laws really rule the world, is what I often say. Then part 2 is a catalog of power laws, meaning the story I shared about vineyards is going to be in there. All the investing stuff is going to be in there. Federer's career will be in. It's all stuff about trees. I mean, it's all the many places these things show up. And then part 3 is a very practical, what can we do about it? Which is, you could summarize that as void negative power laws and pursue positive power laws. So I think there's a lot of very practical wisdom inside those ideas. For example, I don't think most humans probably pay enough attention to making sure they survive. And often it's not the obvious thing. Most people don't ride motorcycles in a dangerous way, but a lot of people eat things that are probably not going to, or are going to compound into bad things over decades. And for the most part, eat or drink those things and then ignore them. So there's practical things there. And then the flip side is, if you're pursuing positive power laws, we've all seen cases of businesses which had enormous potential and didn't reach it, or people that had enormous potential and didn't reach it. Luca tells this story I think about all the time of someone he knows where they were a downhill skier and they were one of the best, but they got injured and had to leave the sport. And so that's a case of, the goal in downhill skiing is not go as fast as possible. The goal is go as fast as possible in a way where the odds that you get injured and have to leave the sport, this is back to racing's to finish first, you first must finish. So that's part 3 is just the very practical, what can we do about this reality we're in? So that's really, that's much of the next year is finishing writing that and getting that out the door. And then I open source all of my, not all, but much of my writing on this, which is on the Substack I run. So there's a section on there on power laws if anyone wanted to double click. And then more stuff like this. Paul, as you pinged me about the treaty thing in the last few days. And I now have a growing number of people, I'm very grateful for this, who just, I'll get these texts in the middle of the night that's like, this thing's a power law too. And so,
many more to come, I suspect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
thank you so much, John.
Yeah. John, thanks for taking the time. And
fun.
Really excited to even in person, hopefully explore some of these power laws eventually. But for now, appreciate the time and we'll
absolutely. No, thank you guys. This was fun and we'll have to do it again sometime. Cool.
Awesome.
Thank you. Bye, John.
Thank you for listening. For more resources, please visit our website, theartofquality.co.